Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into the recently released Last of Us Part 2 and see how it stacks up both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the original 2013 classic, The Last of Us. Now, before we get started, we should in theory expect to see improvements across the board for Naughty Dog's most recent title. So the purpose for this video is to highlight how Naughty Dog's graphical and gameplay design has evolved since 2013. And what you can expect in this highly anticipated sequel. For this analysis, I am recording this footage using a 4K capture card on the PlayStation 4 Pro console, and will be using the remastered version of the original game set to its high resolution mode to ensure the highest quality visuals, though I will throw in a few clips of the original game running at 60 FPS when talking about the gameplay. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off with a look at the presentation, starting with the quality of the character models. Now, if you've played Naughty Dog's past two titles, Uncharted 4 and Lost Legacy, it should come as no surprise just how much more realistic their character models have become. Everything from the poly count to the animation quality has been improved considerably, and The Last of Us Part 2 demonstrates some of the very best looking character designs in their portfolio, while also reworking each character to account for the passage of time in the story. Ellie, for example, now appears much older than before. She's taller, has a deeper voice, and has cut her hair a bit shorter, getting rid of her long ponytail. But she's also more detailed now, with things like freckles being featured more prominently along the surface of her skin. Individual strands of hair can be distinguished between more easily, and other small details like the zipper on her sweatshirt or the texture of her backpack are more clearly defined. One of the best improvements is to her eyes. Ellie's eyes in the first game seem to reflect light a bit too much, giving her these big, shiny puppy dog eyes that are really distracting in a lot of the cutscenes. It looks okay in some scenes, but a lot of the times it just looks off. Thankfully, the more advanced lighting incorporated in the sequel helps to address this problem. Her eyes still reflect light, but it's far more believable now, making her pupils more distinct. Joel has also seen quite a few changes. Just like with Ellie, Joel has aged quite a bit over the years, with more gray hair and a more scruffy beard. Like with Ellie's model, the new lighting render method gives Joel a much more natural presence in the game world, and the shadows applied to details like his facial hair help to make him appear much more realistic as a result. These types of improvements can be found with all the various characters and creatures throughout. It's not quite the same massive leap we saw with Uncharted 3 to Uncharted 4, so all the characters look roughly the same at a distance. But all the minor tweaks applied help to give Part 2 a noticeable edge over its predecessor. Weapon models have similarly seen a nice bump to their complexity. The revolver is one of my favorites, as you can now clearly see the grooves on the inside of the barrel, along with little decals and etchings along the receiver. What's even more impressive is the way the weapons fire now, with new muzzle flash effects and much cleaner animations that really help to make the guns feel more powerful. For the most part, both weapon and character models have seen some drastic improvements, though you may have already noticed one minor flaw in the sequel, the lower resolution. Last of Us Part 2 appears to be targeting a 1440p resolution, as opposed to The Last of Us Remastered that can be set to target an upscaled 2160p. Because of this, these close-ups of our character models appear much more crisp in the original game, and finer details like hairs on Ellie's brow are less defined than they could be. Though, that being said, with all the additional details that have been added in, and considering the average distance that the character models are to the camera, this is not much of an issue, but it is worth noting when looking at some of these close-up comparison images. Next, we have the environments. For those of you unfamiliar, the original Last of Us game follows the story of Joel and Ellie as they travel through a post-apocalyptic United States. And because of the collapse of society, all of America's many towns and cities have been reclaimed by vegetation, providing an eerie yet beautiful backdrop for the action. The campaign provides plenty of unique locations to explore, including the dense city streets of Pittsburgh, several suburban neighborhoods, schools, and an old hospital. Each of these environments is very linear, with some of the larger areas offering optional ruined structures to explore, though moving past certain areas will prevent the player from returning to grab missed items. One of the biggest environments is the university level, where players can ride around a college campus on horseback and hop off to explore dorm rooms and buildings as they make their way to a science building. But despite its large size, it's still very restrictive, with only a couple open buildings to actually investigate along the way. In Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog seems to have carried over the design philosophy used in the past two Uncharted titles, and built much larger, semi-linear environments throughout the campaign. The first open-ended location is downtown Seattle, which is even more overgrown than anything we've seen previously. Old city streets are barely recognizable, disguised as large rolling hills and valleys with some dense forest in between. Players can once again ride around on horseback, dismounting whenever they please. Only the available play zones are much larger than anything in the first game. And the buildings you explore off the beaten path aren't just small hallways with a couple rooms either. These areas are large and feature lots of optional dialogue sequences, secrets, and groups of enemies to deal with, turning Seattle into a sort of post-apocalyptic sandbox. It's still not an open-world game, but the ability to freely explore these few blocks creates an immersive second act. As far as the quality goes, Last of Us 2's environments are a gigantic step up from the first game. Everything is gorgeously detailed, with overgrown vines, leftover debris, and interesting landmarks. The interior spaces also look more believable, with less of those unrealistic rows of waist-high cover foreshadowing an upcoming battle, and more unique and interesting props to accompany each area. One of the best new features is the new grass effects. The original game has some grass sprites sticking out from the side of the roads now and again, but nothing like this. Grass in Part 2 is incredibly dense and blows in the wind, creating beautiful long-distance shimmering effects with little to no noticeable pop-in. But the best part about this grass is that it has actual gameplay implications and can be used to hide from enemies, with different grass length requiring different stances to minimize detection, similar to the grass hiding mechanic introduced in Uncharted 4. Last of Us 2 also includes far more advanced snow tessellation effects. Characters all leave deep footprints in the snow that, surprisingly, seem to stay indefinitely, as opposed to the more simplistic footprint effects in the first game that would fade after leaving a relatively short trail. The environments all around are far more advanced than anything in the original Last of Us. They are far more detailed, with more dynamic props, more believable configurations, and are large enough to really get immersed. The lighting, of course, has also seen some pretty huge advancements. Lighting in the original game wasn't terrible, but it was all baked in, with lots of unnatural color tones that don't hold up very well today. The game ranges from some more natural, dark lighting to completely blown-out contrast with an overly colorful aesthetic, making characters pop unrealistically in the scene. It's visually interesting to look at, but it's not very realistic. With Part 2, Naughty Dog has incorporated the same incredible lighting effects used to create Uncharted 4, allowing for more natural global illumination techniques in combination with some incredible volumetric effects. Interior scenes like this old abandoned synagogue look beautiful, with warm light pouring in through cracked windows and illuminating the dusty interior with some thick volumetric light rays. We can see a few examples of this in the original game, like the station towards the end, but the light rays look less natural, and also look to be baked in for the sake of enhancing the scene. This method may have worked fine for the smaller scope of the original adventure, but with the sequel, these types of effects are everywhere, and really give the experience that next-gen look that Naughty Dog has spent the better part of the past 7 years perfecting. I especially like the way the specular lighting is handled, an effect that Naughty Dog has been toying around with ever since the original Uncharted back in 2007, allowing characters and surfaces to appear drenched either by rain or when emerging from pools of water. And to accompany these improved lighting effects are some great new shadow effects. Shadows are surprisingly one of the weaker aspects of the original game's presentation, with things like character shadows appearing far too sharp, and the environmental shadows like tree leaves not even looking like trees. Part 2 features much better shadow quality, with more naturally diffused projections for both characters and environmental props, along with more advanced ambient occlusion that really helps to draw out the environmental detail even more. It's not perfect, as there's an unnatural looking halo around Ellie's shadow here that shimmers quite a bit, but it's a step in the right direction, and still serves to improve the image quality that much more. Next up, we have effects. Now for the most part, the effects are all miles ahead of the newest game. The snow tessellation and the rain that I mentioned before are truly impressive, and the way the water ripples and splashes looks incredible. However, I was a little bit disappointed by the fire effects. It's not the most common effect in a game like this, though the fire created by the player's Molotov is strangely not as impressive as before. The flames have been toned down a great deal, and the orange glow isn't as noticeable. The Molotovs don't even seem to be as useful in terms of gameplay. In the first game, a Molotov on normal difficulty can kill large groups of enemy infected with ease, thanks to the way the fire would slowly burn their legs and cast them ablaze. But in the sequel, the fire doesn't spread quite as easily, and even if an infected is completely lit on fire, they can somehow shake it off, likely only dealing partial damage. It's likely a tweak made for the sake of balancing, but the overall effect of the Molotov just isn't as impressive as it was before, and also less of a desirable item to craft. Alright, now let's take an in-depth look at how the gameplay has evolved, starting with the general movement and controls. For the most part, The Last of Us Part 2 handles very similarly to the original game. It's played from the third-person perspective with an over-the-shoulder viewpoint, and characters can walk, run, crouch, and climb around semi-linear environments. However, Part 2 does introduce several new abilities. First, players can now lie down prone and crawl around on the ground. This is a hugely useful feature, as you can crawl through grass to lower your chance of detection, and even squeeze into tight spaces to get the drop on opponents. You can even turn around onto your back and aim your weapon, just like in Metal Gear Solid 5. On top of being able to lie prone, players can now jump, adding a bit of platforming to the exploration. It's not at all like platforming in Uncharted, so you won't be flying across any big gaps or anything like that. But it does help to bypass the somewhat repetitive ladder-based climbing puzzles featured in the original game. Alongside this are a few other mechanics that seem to have been pulled straight from Naughty Dog's previous two Uncharted games, including rope climbing and sliding down dirt hills. Though again, these are toned down to match Last of Us's more realistic aesthetic. The combat design has also seen a few tweaks. First, the cover system handles a bit more organically. In the original game, Joel and Ellie would stick to cover automatically, pulling the character model into a semi-locked position to peek and shoot from. This still happens in the latest game, but the animations are much smoother, and it's easier to break away from cover to relocate. Weapon types are also practically the same. There's your one-handed pistols like the revolver and semi-auto pistol, along with two-handed weapons like the shotgun and bolt-action rifle. But thanks to the redesigned sound, firing effects, and new gore system, all of these weapons feel much more powerful. Additionally, Part 2 adds in a new red hit marker indicator, to show when an enemy has been defeated, though you can always turn this off if you find it to be too immersion breaking. Melee weapons also return and behave roughly the same as before, though Naughty Dog did add in a new dodge mechanic, allowing you to avoid an enemy's melee attack. This was likely added in to address the high-risk nature of using melee weapons before. If you didn't swing early enough and hit the enemy first, you could risk getting grappled with no way to escape. But with this ability to dodge, you can now plan melee attacks more carefully, and avoid that initial accidental grapple as you run in for a lethal attack. One change that I'm not quite a fan of is the removal of the shiv mechanic. In the first game, players can craft shivs using resources like scissors and then use them to defeat enemies more quickly. The catch though is that the shivs had a limited durability, and upon use would break apart until you crafted more. Additionally, shivs can also be used to escape clicker grabs, and to access locked doors, effectively rewarding players that could carefully navigate the environment and only use the shivs to bypass the locks. It's an interesting design choice, but it seems to have been eliminated completely in the sequel, as Ellie is armed with her own personal knife instead. Unlike the shiv, this knife cannot be used to break open locks, requiring players to find ways around to open doors from the other side. Also, Ellie's stealth takedown animations always involve stabbing people in the neck, replacing Joel's chokehold animation, and can be done an infinite amount of times, even against clickers, without having to worry about durability. Next up, we have our enemy design. For those of you unfamiliar, The Last of Us has two main antagonists, human enemies, commonly referred to as the Hunters, and the Infected, with long-term infected turning into blind but powerful clickers. Both of these enemy types return in the sequel, and function pretty much exactly the same, though the AI, especially for the human enemies, has been improved a great deal, allowing for much more dynamic and tense confrontations. Enemies will flank and investigate last known positions just like they did before, but their chatter is more diverse, and their methods for hunting have been improved. Some groups even use tracker dogs that can follow your scent trail as you navigate the area. The original game's combat has always been brutal and intense, with plenty of standoffs and some decent AI to outsmart. But with Last of Us 2's more complex environments and new features like tall grass and prone to take advantage of, the action feels even more immersive. However, the combat is only one half of the experience. The other half is spent searching abandoned structures top to bottom for dirty old rags and spare bullets. This concept remains practically untouched in the sequel, though it does feel a bit more realized. The actual looting animations, for example, look more realistic now. Ellie will pull open drawers and reach with her free hand to grab items inside, whereas before, Joel would just wave his hand over objects to pick them up. A lot of the same resources like rags, alcohol, and blades are still scattered sparingly throughout the world, and players can seamlessly combine items to craft tools from found recipes. But the tools that can be crafted aren't quite the same, at least not their names. Nail bombs, for example, are now explosive traps, and smoke bombs are now renamed stun bombs, but can be upgraded to function exactly the same way. One of the few actual new craftable items is the suppressor, which is essentially just a water bottle taped to the barrel of the pistol. This suppressor has about 3 to 5 shots before it breaks, and can be used to silently dispatch enemies without giving away your position, and can also be manually detached and saved for later. A lot of the upgrade systems return, including weapon parts and workbenches, though the toolkit requirements, which effectively spaced out more powerful attachments throughout the campaign, have been removed. The workbench itself is also more detailed, and Ellie will actually break apart weapons at the bench and swap out attachments, showing a visual improvement to your arsenal as you progress further. Another interesting change has been made to the player upgrade system. In the original game, bottles of pills can be found and used to upgrade basic stats, including overall health, crafting speed, and the like. This idea is carried over in Part 2, though there are new distinct skill trees, each dealing with a different style of gameplay, including combat, crafting, and stealth. And like most skill trees in games, you can't access the most powerful abilities until you unlock prereqs first, which helps to space out the more powerful abilities for the later half of the campaign. Other changes include new trading card collectibles, the ability to chuck bricks and bottles through windows to access structures, and a few UI tweaks to looting icons, removing the red indicator for ammunition and just making them all appear as small white icons on the screen instead. And finally, I wanted to talk about the multiplayer. Unfortunately, Last of Us Part 2 is the first Naughty Dog game since 2007 to not feature some form of multiplayer options. It's a real shame too, because the original Last of Us has a phenomenal multiplayer mode that combines most of the campaign's general combat and crafting mechanics to make a tense competitive experience. Naughty Dog hasn't necessarily ruled out the possibility of multiplayer being added, or even releasing as a separate standalone game, but for now, the experience is entirely single player. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you think has the better audio design?
Just like that.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, The Last of Us Part 2 is an incredible achievement by the team at Naughty Dog. It takes everything that made the original game special and improves on it, with great new gameplay mechanics, enhancements to pre-existing features, and an unbelievable visual leap forward. It's not perfect, as the hardware limitations of the PlayStation 4 and PS4 Pro are forcing Naughty Dog to limit the resolution and tone down some of the effects. But the final result is a game that looks remarkably photorealistic and incredibly immersive. But what do you guys think? Are you happy with the presentation and gameplay design of Last of Us Part 2? Or do you still prefer the original game? Let me know in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.